Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the webinar on proven strategies for increasing user adoption. My name is Laura Madsen, and I am the practice leader for Lancet. Please go ahead and enter in any questions into the question box on the webinar there. And particularly if you have any issues with seeing the screen or hearing me, that would be great. As we get started, one of the things that always helps me with webinars is to ask people where they're at in their current phase of work. And in this case in particular, I'm curious as to your level of adoption, or how you perceive your level of adoption for your business intelligence applications at your organizations. So we're going to go ahead and just take a couple of minutes here and do a quick poll question. And again, this is just going to help me understand where everyone is at, so I can try to get the information that I provide you a little bit more specific to where the majority of you are at. So if you just take a few minutes to answer that, that'd be great. Good. All right, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So it looks like we have about 20% of you, I'm obviously rounding up, are struggling. Have what you would consider a poorly adopted solution. But 67 of you are presenting your adoption as improving, so that's really great. And then the remaining folks indicate that they are rock stars and are just here to kill an hour. And I really appreciate you spending that hour with me. As we get started here, I just want to let you guys know that I have a little bit of a cold. So not only do I sound a little bit off, but every once in a while I start to cough. I'll do my best to mute the phone if that happens, but ask you to bear with me as we get through this. So when I talk about user adoption, I really put it in the context of three things. And I'm not saying that these are the only three things that drive user adoption or drive the lack of user adoption. But in my experience, this has been the primary issues that I've seen with organizations as they attempt to get their BI programs more broadly adopted. The first thing is ease of use. Now, over time, for the business intelligence tools in particular, ease of use has improved a great deal, but we still struggle with the concept of ease of use for a lot of organizations, and sort of in particular, folks that compare other software applications or just other applications to their business intelligence world. So what I'm trying to get at there is things like Google have really impacted people's perceptions of how easy things should be, and when you're trying to query something, why doesn't it take the same amount of time as Google? So we'll talk a little bit about that. The other one is training. And this one is sort of interesting in that many of us sort of feel like we shouldn't have to train our end users because the applications are supposed to be easy to use. And for you and me, they probably are pretty easy to use, but to your end users, they're not always that easy to use. So oftentimes what happens is we will provide training at the beginning of our exercise, our deployment, our initial implementation, and then we won't provide any training after that. And users often need refresher courses, so that definitely impacts long-term user adoption. And then the final one, and the one that's probably most difficult and one that most people recognize as a primary driver for a user adoption is the trust, primarily the trust of the data. And so we'll talk a fair amount about what that means and how do we resolve that. So a while back I did a LinkedIn poll to some of the BI groups that I participate with, and I asked people this question: which thing drives user adoption the most in your opinion? And as you can see, although this is not statistically significant, and my statistics teacher from college would probably frown upon me using this, but most people indicated that they felt like the trust in the data and the reports is the primary driver or driver to either good adoption or poor adoption. So if you don't trust it, you don't adopt. If you do trust it, you generally do adopt. The second one is the ease of use of the application. And then the third one is training. I had a couple other people say a few other things. Nobody reported metadata, which was sort of interesting to me in that I sort of feel like metadata is related to at least two of these. And so nobody called out metadata specifically in their response. So the question becomes, why is user adoption so complicated? You would feel like, I would feel like, and I have felt like, in comparison to doing some of the really complex things that we have to do from a data warehousing perspective, creating relational databases on very complex data and having high quality data standards for data that's not very, high quality. Why is it so darn difficult to get users to adopt something as simple as a report that's supposed to make their lives easier? So I think one thing we have to understand is that user adoption is very complicated because it's multifaceted. It's not just one thing. It's not like I can fix this one thing and therefore everything else will be fixed. There are multiple issues that you're dealing with that drive your ability to have good user adoption. So you can have the best communication plan in the world around your BI application, and that often helps your BI program as a whole. But if your data model isn't exactly optimized for reporting or analytics or those kinds of things, then people generally won't adopt. But the opposite is true too. So if you have a really poor communication plan but a really great data model, if you're not telling people about it, then it doesn't matter. Rogue IT departments impact user adoption, and this is, of course, a hot topic for any BI program. And when I mean IT, or what I mean by rogue IT departments, are those groups out there that maybe asked you for help a year ago, but you were too busy to do it, and they ended up having to create their own solution either in Excel or Access. And that solution worked pretty well for them, so they continued to use it. And then they continued to share it with other groups. And now those other groups are referring to it, and that Excel spreadsheet or that Access database has become a source of truth. So the interesting thing about our organizations today versus even 10 years ago is that people are a lot more data savvy and computer savvy than they used to be fresh out of college. So we're finding more and more sophisticated end users out there with the ability to create really complex Excel spreadsheets, and as such those are becoming the source of truth for a lot of these instances. Rumors certainly impact user adoption, and if you've ever had a quote-unquote difficult end user, you know what I mean. But I've worked at organizations where I've had end users going off saying, well, I overheard them talking and they said that they couldn't figure out how to fix it. And so I'd get a call from the VP 2 days later saying, well, I heard it's broken and you won't be able to fix it. And that had nothing to do with it. She just happened to overhear a conversation. So it's true that rumors impact user adoption. And unfortunately, that's one of the most difficult things to address when you're dealing with these kinds of things. And finally, we all have to keep in mind that there's no magic bullet. There's no easy way to fix this. You can't just take a pill. User adoption will never increase if your program isn't well managed. So there's if there's a fundamental flaw in how your program is constructed, regardless to where that resides, if it's in project management or your service level agreements with data warehouse availability. We already talked about the data model and whether that's optimized. If any of those things are broken, it can impact user adoption. So the real lesson there is you have to fix those problems first in order to increase user adoption. So here are my 6 quote-unquote easy steps to increasing user adoption. And easy, is sort of relative. Excuse me for just a minute. But we'll dig into each of these a little bit more. So when we talk about ease of use, what does that mean? And 2 things that you can do is you can get to know your users by creating personas. We'll talk through more of that. And then actually trying to use the Google effect to your advantage. And the Google effect is what I was talking about earlier, where everybody thinks that searching for things should be relatively easy based on their experience with things like Google. Then we'll talk a little bit about training. And the fact that you always have to have training available is certainly one thing. But talk about different channels of delivery for that training. So you can't just always have a lecture kind of format where somebody's up there talking with folks, because that's not always available. So we'll talk about how to get different levels of training out into your organization. And then we'll talk about continued support and training along those same lines. And then finally, trust in the data and the reports themselves. We'll talk a little bit about how to create a data governance program, which helps drive trust overall from a data perspective. And then finally, just sort of this communicate, understand, and listen. And we'll talk about specific questions around that. So before we get started into the 6 easy steps, I think we have one more poll question here. Excuse me. Just kind of curious, wanting to know, are there any other areas where you really want me to talk about besides these 6 that you feel like are really important? Take just a minute to answer that question. One of each.
All right, I think I'm going to close it as 64%.
All right. So looks like each of you are just sort of equally curious about each of those things. So we will talk about data dictionaries for sure, and if we get to it, we'll address BI tools, sort of specific tools around user adoption, and then sponsorship. We did get a question early on about whether or not this presentation will be provided, and it will be provided to you in a follow-up email. All right. So when we talk about ease of use, the most important thing that we have to start with is understanding who your users are. And this is something that I work with all my clients on, is getting a base understanding of your users. So this is what I call my user continuum. And I've sort of developed this over the past 10 years or so that I've been working in this industry. And if you look at this, it's a standard bell curve. And when you look to the left of that bell curve, what you see is this profile of executives. And those executives really, they need high-level information, like a dashboard, something that's very visual. And we call this user type a view user type. So essentially these folks either don't have the time or the capability. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're executives. Maybe they just don't really work well with software. But this user profile means that they don't really have the ability, whether it's time or capability, to be able to do much with the software. So they really need something that's visually impactful and very easy for them to use. That's why dashboards make the most sense for this group. I like to sort of represent this group as they get in the morning, they turn on their computer, and if their screen is green, they can go get a cup of coffee, and if it's red, they have to call somebody. Okay, so that's the level of usage that we're looking at. On the opposite side of that continuum, on the right-hand side, you have your analysts. And these folks really could not care less about what the user interface looks like. And as a matter of fact, a lot of them just get frustrated with user interfaces. If they can get the data in an Excel sheet or in another analytic tool like an Access database or even something as sophisticated as SAS, they don't really care about how pretty it is. They really just need to be able to manipulate the data. These people know that data incredibly well, and they have that ability to get in there and mess with it without too much guidance. In most organizations, your analysts are probably somewhere between 2 to 5% of your true end users. You can have people that have an analyst in their title. It does not make them an analyst. Okay? And then in the middle, the majority of your end users are what we call the average associate, or the interactive level of users. And what I mean by that is they have the ability to interact with the software. They can respond to prompts, they can run reports, they can even schedule reports. They're relatively comfortable using software. The complexity associated with this group is that their experiences are relatively broad. So if you look right in the middle, you have those folks that are just kind of, your rock solid end users. They interact, they don't have too many problems. But on the left side, getting closer to your executives, those people are maybe just learning or really get nervous about using computers, and there's still people out there like that, believe it or not. And so they're bordering on the executive level as far as users, but they can still kind of get around it. These people will definitely be calling you a lot. Then you have on the other side of that, of course, those people that are closer to the analyst side. And those people would be maybe like me, where I'm trained as an analyst. I have a lot of experience analyzing data, but I've not done it for a long time. So it probably wouldn't take me too long to figure it out. But in the meantime, I'm still figuring it out. So the complexity with managing your end users is that you really have 5 different types of end users that you're trying to address their needs. And when you're delivering out, and especially when you start talking about ease of use, each of these buckets have very different wants and needs from a user interface perspective. So the more you know about your end users, the better off you'll be. Okay, so we just got a question here. Most of my end users fall into the executive user bucket. How can I move them forward? That's a great question. So you're going to find that there are some people that will always be a quote-unquote executive level user. They may never be able to get out of that. And many of those folks, it might just be that they don't have the time to be able to learn it and don't have the interest. So those would be your true executives, like your vice presidents or your chief X officers. But for those other people that just get a little nervous or maybe don't have a strong level of interest, you can create training programs and incentives associated with getting people on the system that will help drive user adoption. Excuse me just a minute. So, in some respects, that means you're going to have to make sure that all your training is really simple for people to understand. And you're going to have to find ways to incent people to get them further along the user continuum, or that user adoption curve, to make sure that you get people from the executives to more of an interactive without calling your team every 15 seconds. And there is some work that has to happen there, definitely from a training perspective. All right. So how do you figure that out? How do you figure out what your user base is like, or your particular user continuum at your organization? And you do this through creating personas. And I stole this idea from the web world, and this is how they create websites, by understanding who their users are, and they create these personas. So certainly creating these personas will help you understand your end users. You can put your end users into buckets and then prioritize for those buckets. So here you can see that I have sort of this power user, interactive user, view user, and I've created these buckets. But you can create as many buckets as you feel like you can manage. So maybe as many as 5, like on the bell curve, or 7, or how many ever you can feel like you can particularly manage. This way you really better understand your user base, and then you can develop specifically for them. So essentially how you do this is either just by the fact that you know your end users so well, you can sort of bucket them into these areas of usage type, just based on the fact that you know that Susie always goes right to the data, and she doesn't really like interacting with software, but she's okay in Excel and she's happy there. and all the way down to Joe, who really needs the executive level format because he just doesn't have time to be able to figure that out. You can bucket those just based on your own knowledge of those people. Or you can create a survey that will help you bucket them based on a handful of questions that you ask. And those questions would be things like, you know, do you like interacting with the software? How comfortable are you with the things like date prompts? How comfortable are you with the ambiguity when you don't understand how software works, or that kind of a thing? So you just create a couple of questions and then associate the answer of those questions to particular buckets. So if somebody says no to the question of, you know, do you like ambiguity when it comes to software, then you know they're probably not a power user, right? And that's how you build out your personas. So the Google effect. Excuse me. Yeah, I love Google. I use it every day, probably 16,000 times a day, although that's a completely false statistic. But they really have made our jobs in the data warehousing world that much more difficult, because we have now we have end users that really expect, you know, 13,874,984 results in 0.13 seconds, and that, by the way, was when I Googled GUI. I got that many results in that time frame. Excuse me. The other impact of Google, of course, is that it's a very elegant and easy to use interface. Even now, 10 years later, they have not mired down their user interface with anything other than the word Google, or sometimes, you know, a little Halloween-y kind of Google, or a Kansas Google. And then the address search bar. That's it. They've never done much else with it. And so it's a really nice, simple, and easy user interface. It doesn't distract the end users from what they're trying to get to. Whereas when you log in almost any other BI tool, after you log in, there's 2 or 3 different options that end users can go to. And, you know, again, if you're really comfortable with software, that's not a big deal. But if you're not, and you only use it once every 3 months when you have to run your quarterly reports, that can get really confusing. So the question is, how do you manage the expectation when you don't have a Google-like user interface or a Google-like performance? So let's start with the GUI, the general user interface. First things first, we all understand that the BI tools that exist today have, some of them have better user interfaces than others. So what you want to do is you want to make it as good for them as possible. So for one thing, don't make them dig for something that should be easy to find. So if you know that there's a handful of reports that people run all the time, figure out how to get that as high up in the hierarchy as you can. Now, I know there are security implications for some tools that you can't really move it up, but if there's any opportunity for you to move that up into the hierarchy so they don't have to click, then do that. Take advantage of that opportunity. Remember to make it as simple for them as possible. An important thing is, don't assume that a customizable user interface is your saving grace. So if you're out and you're looking for BI tools and you want to make, you know, you're asking the question in your RFP, or you asked the question in your RFP, do you have the SDK capability? Most of them will say yes. But then from a management perspective, if you're your BI manager or BI director in your organization, what does that mean for you? And one of the biggest implications to SDK for BI tools is any kind of customization isn't supported by that organization, by that product organization. So the more you customize, the further away you get from those that BI tool, that product group being able to support you if something happened. For most of us, it's worth the risk, but for some of us, that's kind of a big issue. So don't assume that that's going to be your saving grace. With that said, with the SDK, you can do just about anything you'd want to do in order to make that user interface more specific to your organization or easier for your folks to use. So there's got to be a balance there of pros and cons between making it really easy to use, but also making it relatively easy for you to roll back, maybe in a separate environment to be able to roll back so you can maintain that product at the level that you need to maintain it at. One really easy way for you to understand your user's perspective from using your tool is to count the clicks. So again, if you know that there's one report that Susie uses all the time, log in like you're Susie and count the number of clicks it takes for you to just render that report. It sounds really simple, but there's been a lot of research that says that most users think that anything above 10 clicks is too many. So imagine how quickly you can do 10 clicks in a BI tool. A lot of BI tools that I've seen that have been deployed in organizations, it's 10 clicks just to log on to the dang thing. So count your clicks. Log in as an end user. Log in as those different types of personas, like you're trying to get to a particularly popular run report, and figure out how many clicks it is. And if it's 20, then try to figure out how you can reduce the number of clicks. It's a relatively easy way to figure out how your end users are actually interacting with the software. Okay. So those are a couple of steps that you can do on ease of use. Now we're going to talk about training. So first things first, we have to keep in mind that we can't settle for just one method of training. For lots of different reasons, right? For one thing, not everybody learns the same way. But for another thing, if you have a whole bunch of users that only use your application quarterly to run their quarterly reports or monthly to run their monthly reports, they have a day job that they do that distracts their brain from remembering those details about your application in between those months and quarters that they're running it. So if you're wondering why you always have to answer Susie's question about how to respond to date prompts, that's why. Because she's always distracted the rest of the time, and she doesn't have time to sort of lock that into her long-term memory and bring that up as a recall every month or quarter. It's really easy to fix. Just create a little mini training module and put it out onto your intranet site, your local internet site that your end users can log into that will remind them how to do things like change their password, or how to respond to date prompts, or even for some of your higher end users that have the ability to create reports, do a little mini PowerPoint session on your intranet that shows them how to move objects into your workspace. You can take just about anything in a BI tool and create a little vignette for it on an internet like that, using Camtasia or something like that, and just put that out there so that people can access it whenever they want. And when you do that, your calls will reduce pretty quickly. So that's one method of doing that, so people can just sort of self-select when they've forgotten something. You also have to remember that nothing takes the place of having somebody in front of them walking them through the training. So a lecture kind of a scenario. It doesn't always have to be in person. Maybe it's on the phone or distance learning or something like that. But having a live person that can either teach them or answer their questions or train them on a particular capability really helps, particularly if you're deploying a product for the first time. And timing matters. Let me tell you that I've worked with organizations that said to me, well, we trained all the users, and I asked them when they trained them, and it was about 2 months prior to the deployment of the product. And that does 100% no good. You might as well not spend your money. Really, again, these folks are busy. This is not their day job. So the important thing is to train them as closely to deployment as feasibly possible. If you know you're going to release on Monday, do the training on a Friday. Or better yet, push the deployment off till Wednesday and do the trainings on Monday and Tuesday. And make absolutely sure that that window of time between when they're being trained and when they actually get their hands on the application is as minimal as possible. Because people forget this kind of stuff if there's not something tangible to remind themselves of it really quickly. It's important to keep your training up to date. As you make changes to your application, whether that be through things like the SDK or changing your user interface, adding reports or adding capabilities, update your training. We always forget to do that. So when you go out in training, you're like, oh, sorry, this is from last, version 8.7. It looks different now. That doesn't help, because it doesn't help people have those memory prompts when they log in themselves, because it looks different. So you have to make sure that you update your training to make it look consistent. Offer your training frequently. Just put out a calendar out there. Schedule it every 2 months and have people sign up. If nobody signs up or only one person signs up, you can cancel it. But that way people can plan ahead, and then they know when the training is coming up. It's important to require some level of testing. And this would be for both your interactive and your power users. Maybe not so much for your executive users, but there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, they know you're serious, and they're going to pay more attention in class. But number two, particularly for your power users, you're going to give these folks access to these data and new capabilities within a new software, or a software that's new to them. And you want to make sure that they really understand what that means. So if you test them on it, make sure that they pass before you give them access to the application. I've seen that work really well in other organizations. It doesn't have to be a really complex test. As a matter of fact, you don't even have to make them pass, quote unquote pass. Maybe it's as long as they get 50% of the answers right, they're okay. But the idea is that you know that they're going to pay more attention because they know there's going to be a quiz at the end. It's like you paid more attention in high school when the teacher told you there'd be a quiz at the end. Use your own data as much as possible when you're creating your training. Sometimes it's hard if you're doing a brand new deployment, you don't have that data ready, and in those scenarios that's fine. But if you can come up with examples for your training that are real life examples at least, even if you don't have the data to reflect that, that's always better. On the same line of thought, make sure your trainers understand the data. If your trainers have no context for that data and they're training, again, particularly power users, but certainly interactive users as well, the training doesn't always go that well. So you want to make sure that those trainers have the ability to answer some questions for those users and not just say, well, I'll have to get back to you on that. Because that is your opportunity to make sure that your end users understand not only the capabilities of the software, but what happens to that data as well. And then something very easy to do is use satisfaction surveys at the end of the training, and then take the feedback that you get and actually make the next training session a little bit better. And this is, actually I've done this, and that's where I've learned some of these points. I asked people what they wanted more, and they said, I need somebody that actually understands the data. I need people that understand the capability of the tool. I want us to use our own data so I understand how it will actually work when I get back to my desk. I had somebody tell me, the fact that this is on an older version of the software makes it harder for me to recall it when I get back to my desk. So all of these are from results of surveys that I've given in the past as I've done this work. And it really does help make your training that much more impactful to your end users. So this is sort of related to training, but the idea is you always want to support your user base. If your end users feel like they have somebody to call or someplace to go, like an intranet to find a how do I change my password kind of thing, they're just going to be more likely to adopt your application. So make sure that you have a good training that's available all the time with different methods of training available. Make sure your end users have the ability to call somebody and ask questions. So that's kind of the one-call resolution kind of a thing. Make sure you have user group meetings, and you don't have to have these real often, maybe twice a year, but it's an opportunity for people to ask questions in a more public forum about what the product does, what it can do, what it should do, and what it will do in the future. Newsletters are something that a lot of groups do. They're relatively easy to put out, and you could, do maybe 2 or 3 newsletters a year, and it just keeps the communication line open. And again, your end users feel like things are being actively worked on your application, and that's important to them. Make sure you have a metadata repository. So this is back to The question about data dictionaries. So data dictionaries and metadata repositories are closely related. But the idea here is make sure you have a method of communicating back out to your end users what that data means to your organization. So whether you do that through a traditional metadata repository, which is built into your system, built into your BI application, so as they're running things and a metric pops up, they have a tooltip that explains exactly what that metric is, or there's a PDF of your data dictionary for your organization's data out on the intranet site. Make sure you have one way of that or another so that people know what data means and how it's defined and how it's actually propagated to your BI application. Wikis are another great way to do this, and wikis have a lot, are being used a lot in data governance programs, and I think we'll talk about that next. But it's a collaboration site where people can ask questions, and it's not always questions back to your BI group, right? But it's sometimes it's questions out to the data stewards or out to a different group of people. But essentially, it's just a way to get people talking about the data or the reports or the application itself. And any opportunity you have to provide that level of communication out to your end users is always useful. So, let's see, I think I might have skipped a slide here. Let me just make sure. So we just got a question in about question about user group meetings and how do you organize these, which customers, and what if they are competitors. So that's interesting. I'm not sure about the competitors part, but so how do you organize user group meetings? And I've organized them just like webinars in the past. And you put out your schedule of the, we're going to have it on Thursday at 3 o'clock Central Time. Here's the dial-in number. Here's our agenda. And the nice thing about user group meetings in a large group setting is you get to drive the agenda. So you can tell people exactly what you want them to know and not tell them what you don't want them to know. So it's a really great way to do that. A lot of times with user group meetings, what you want to do is make sure you have a standard agenda that's easy for everybody to understand. So, what was recently built out, what new capabilities is being built into the tool, what new data is being added, what reports are being added, that kind of a thing. Certainly, if you have a mixed user group like that, where you have competitors and maybe just plain old-fashioned customers, have two different user groups. So I used to do this at one of my organizations. I would have a quote-unquote internal user group where my peers, the employees of the company that use the application, would dial into one call, and then the next hour I would have a user group meeting for my external users, my customers, people that paid to have access to this system. I would have them dial into a separate call. The topics were very similar. The difference was, I didn't air my dirty laundries nearly so much as I did with my peers, my other employees, as I did with my external customers. I would just present the same topic in a little bit different way. So that's what I would recommend if you have a situation where you have sort of two very different user types, like customers or competitors. So when we're talking about just projects in general, and this slide is a little bit of a tangent, but bear with me here for a minute. So how do you transition users in particular when we start talking about deploying new capabilities or deploying a brand new BI tool? When you get a lot of the "I'm too busy," "I don't understand," "I don't care," or "I don't want to" kind of responses. And I've been there, I've heard this, and it is really challenging, no question. One of the things I want to make sure that we all recognize, though, is we don't fall into the trap of thinking that our end users are big fat whiners. I read and this has been a really popular topic lately on the Wire. I've read a number of LinkedIn groups and blog postings about this, of bordering on saying my end users are stupid, and I couldn't possibly train them if I wanted to, kind of responses to this topic. And what I really want to encourage you to think about is think about it from their perspective. Put yourself in their shoes. For you and I, this stuff comes as second nature because this is our work. This is what we do. We understand data. We understand software. But for our business users, this is the last thing on their very long list of last things to do. And they don't want to have to spend time getting to know data, getting to understand applications. And they really are very busy. And we're busy too, but the idea is it's not a busyness question. It's a question of what do you naturally understand and what you naturally do not understand. And a lot of end users just naturally do not understand this kind of thing. So I just want to encourage you to think about it from their perspective and get in their shoes as much as possible. And when they say things like, I don't understand or I don't want to, what is really driving that? Is it a fact that they just don't have the time? Is it the fact that they don't understand? There's a reason why they're using those sort of broad categorizations. So I just encourage you to find that out a little bit more in depth. Okay, and I think we have our last poll question for today. And if you could just take a couple seconds for me and answer this question, again, just sort of helping me understand what kind of users you're all dealing with out there as we delve into our next topic on trust. So just a couple of seconds here.
Doing great.
Okay, only half of you have voted. Either the other half have stopped listening, or they don't know. Maybe it's the group that has the Rockstar user adoption and are just looking to kill an hour that haven't voted. All right. Good. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you are not quite the majority, but a lot of you have a ready but reticent group. That means that they are ready but sort of not so 100% on board. About a third of you have the ready and willing category, which is great. Those are the best kind of end users to have for sure. But then a number of you have reticent but can be won over, so you have a little bit of work to do on your hands. And then 11% of you have the difficult end users. So, I think that, most of us have a little bit of each of these in our end user base. The important thing, of course, is how that is distributed. If you have a lot of difficult users, you have a big road, big hill to climb. The question is, where do you want to spend your time when we start talking about user adoption? And I would say for sure that where you want to spend your time is in this area of building and maintaining the trust and the level of trust within your organization. So let's just dive into that a little bit more. And I think that's true for any of you that are dealing with sort of difficult or reticent but willing but could be won over. The easiest way to lose trust or to move your end users from ready but reticent over to the just plain difficult is to lose their trust. So this is an important topic for all of us. So what is trust? And oddly enough, when I started thinking about this, I had to Google it. No, I didn't Google it. I looked it up in the dictionary. But trust is really defined as in these contexts, and I defined it more in the context of data and software for us. But this is how it was identified. It's around accessibility, reliability, consistency, and honesty. So it's an easy topic for us to understand when we start looking at software and BI tools and making things accessible. Sorry about that. So obviously making things accessible, and that really means just that it's ready and it's willing and it's available, right? Maybe you have a service level agreement that your application is up 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, kind of a thing, 8 to 5. But when you say that it's available, it's always available, so it has high accessibility. Then there's a reliability. So can they rely on the data? Every time they go out there, is it reliably correct or reliably accessible? So there's two different aspects there, but it's a reliable concept, right? Or a reliable thing. Then there's consistency. So do you do it over and over and over again, and do you do it the right way over and over and over again? And that's important too, is you want to make sure that you're always being consistent about how you're delivering things. You're consistent, and you're consistent when you're available, and it's always reliable, and those kinds of things. They're all very closely related. And then finally, you have an aspect of honesty, and sometimes that honesty is really difficult, but are you being honest about things and delivering things from an honest perspective? They'll be able to see through you if they know that you're not being honest. So one way to do this is to make sure that you create a governance program. And we don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of depth on this, but this is one area that if you create this, just creating it creates a lot of trust within your organization. Obviously, data governance programs are meant to do all these things that we have bulleted out on the list here. But one of the primary things that you have to keep in mind is that if they know that you're that committed to creating good data, that you're created a governance program, that in itself often will improve trust. Here's what a data governance structure can look like. And I know that there's a lot of folks that talk about data governance and talk about it in the context of what costs a lot of time and money, that kind of thing. But I personally believe that you can build the data governance structure out using existing structures that you have today, existing groups, existing meetings, that kind of a thing. So there doesn't have to be an additional overhead. You're just asking people to extend their agenda for each of these. As a matter of fact, I have an entire webinar on what I call a data governance starter kit, and you can find that at lancetsoftware.com under our resource center, and you can check out that webinar, and it'll walk you through in detail how to do this. This is sort of breaks down the who does what on your data governance council. But essentially what you have to know is that at each level of your organization, everybody will not be involved, but will have the opportunity to participate at one way or the other through sort of this idea of a constituency, which is the concept of governance, okay? Just going to skip ahead here. So another concept of trust is talking about how you manage expectations and how you communicate out to your end users. And communicating, understanding, and listening is really a big part of this job when we talk about increasing our user adoption. So when you look at this slide and you sort of see this sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of what they thought, what they wanted released all the way down to what they think they got, this is actually a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. And the idea is the bigger the gap between what they thought they were going to get and what they actually got, the more unsatisfied they will be. So if they really felt like they were going to get Buckingham Palace and they ended up with a shack in the middle of Arkansas, that's a really big gap. And the more unsatisfied your user base is going to be. The closer you can get that gap, the better off you'll be. So what that means is when you're communicating out about what this is going to be, you want to build enthusiasm, but you absolutely do not want to build unreasonable expectations about what it will be. You can tell people that it's going to be something over time, but make sure that you understand, or they understand, I should say, that they're not going to get Buckingham Palace. But you certainly don't want to deliver the shack in Arkansas either, so you have to control the hype factor. That's the idea. Sometimes trust in you will buy you some time. So say something went south and you're really trying to fix it as quickly as you can. You just don't have time to communicate it. Sometimes you can just say to people, I promise you I'm working on it as fast as I can. I'll get back to you as soon as I have something. But just don't rely on that all the time. You don't want to overuse that. And again, use many methods of communication to get your message out. We talked about that already, but have newsletters, have user group meetings, use email, that kind of a thing. We talked about training a little bit, but here's another concept around education, and education associated with broader BI concepts. Make sure you educate them on the process, so how things get developed and deployed, and then the key milestones. And you can do that through things like your wiki pages or SharePoint, that kind of a thing. You want to make sure you define all your acronyms at least one point or another. Don't assume that people know what ETL means or any of the other acronyms that we throw out on a daily basis. If you have an industry-specific thing like manufacturing or healthcare or finance, make sure that you're defining a lot of industry standard acronyms as well. The interesting thing is acronyms can sort of overlap each other between industries, so don't assume anything there. Make sure you're providing that education based on their role in the organization. If you have a whole bunch of analysts, you can dive into a lot more detail than with your executives. Enlist others' help and make sure that you gain and keep the trust of the users enlist help from others to help build that trust of the end users. So if you know you have a really dedicated person out there that uses it all the time, ask them for help and ask them to be out there evangelizing your program. And just keep doing these things over and over and over and over again. Repetition is the key to learning. Okay, as we're wrapping up here, I kind of went quickly through those last few slides, but a couple of points on this. A bit of housekeeping is what I call it. Make sure you have some kind of knowledge around your rogue IT departments. It doesn't mean you're going to be able to fix them, but if you know that somebody is out there using an Excel sheet as a source of record, just make sure you know about it. Make sure you understand how they're doing it. Make sure that you understand who's using it, because at some point the idea is that you would replace that source of record, that Excel sheet, with some kind of capability in your system. So make sure that you know where those rogue IT departments are. And again, focus on your warehouse. If you have that foundation built right, this job becomes a lot easier. So don't ignore things like good ETL scripts, solid data models, that kind of thing. You need to make sure that you clean up that mess if it's a mess. And when good users go bad. So this happens. Sometimes things happen and user adoption goes south for one reason or another. So what do you do when you release it and nobody uses it? How do you elevate your end users' ability to understand? And what do you do when business users refuse to make changes to their processes? And how can you change the fate of your project when everyone else has given up? And there's no easy answer to any of these questions, but again, I really think it's all about your end users. So if they have given up on you or given up on the product or given up on the data, it starts small and get some quick wins in there. So maybe you have to go back to the drawing board and recreate everything. That sucks, no question about it. But make sure you're honest with them. Again, talking about the concept of trust, accessibility, reliability, consistency, and honesty. So make sure that you're telling them, look guys, we screwed up, right? But here's how we're going to fix it. And we're going to fix it by releasing these pieces quickly to you, or maybe not so quickly, but once we send it to you, it's going to be right. Don't assume that they're going to automatically adopt once you start re-releasing content. Make sure that they understand that you know that you have to work hard to win them over. And that kind of a thing often wins over the hardest of your end users. If you have you released it and nobody uses it, you missed the mark, FYI. And I don't know what that mark was, but that's what you have to find out. Either the report isn't working for them based on how they use it, the decisions that they have to make aren't being driven by that report, they don't know how to use the application to get to the report in the first place. However, whatever happened, you missed the mark on it, and that's a tough thing to admit, but once you admit that, then you can kind of go back to the drawing board and make those adjustments. So just quickly in summary, make sure your application and the data you're presenting is as easy to use as possible. Remember that ease of use is different for everyone. So when you're doing this, make sure that you understand what your different buckets of end users are. Train your end users and know that you're never going to be done with that training. Make sure that you know and they know that you believe that trust in the data is critical. So you're going to build out your data governance program to make sure that you have a high quality set of data. Maintain a high level of honesty with your end users. You don't want to air your dirty laundry, but they can see through you, so make sure that you're prepared to have those tough conversations. And let me tell you that this is absolutely the hard work. There is no magic bullet to improving end user adoption. If you thought building out a data warehouse was hard, try getting people to adopt it. So it's really hard work, and hopefully these steps here will help you as you work on this journey of end user adoption. So that is our time. I don't know if there's anyone that can have any questions. You can go ahead and put quickly into the little webinar box there. But if at any point you have any questions, comments, or concerns about today's content, please feel free to contact me there. You can reach me anytime at my email. There's my phone number. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter. Sometimes you have to put up with personal things like I'm flying and I got the airplane flu, but most of the time I focus on work. You can also find me on the BI Network. I'm the co-host of the Healthcare Channel. I write articles for them every once in a while. And I blog with some frequency on our website here at Lancet, blog.lancetsoftware.com. Thank you all for your time today. I appreciate it, and I hope to see you again at our next webinar.